Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
When I was in the middle of the university course, I was doing law at the Prague Czech University, and when Hitler came, the first thing he must have done was to close the universities, so that was that. And one had to start doing something, because what became clear to us in the first day or two, that we won't be allowed to finish studying even if he sort of opens the university, which he never did, by the way. And one has to do something to earn some living or something, so I started to learn hat making on the side, and I did some language courses which I could manage, sort of finish off at that time, which was in French and in English. And I got my exams and my exams papers, and that everything worked still. But then one of the rules came after the other by the Germans, not to be able to go to the cinema, to the theatre, to concerts, to the parks, not to use the public transport except when they were 2 cars of the trams, so you used the back one. Not to use the buses only at certain times. All these things which were really irksome, nothing else, but one had to adjust to it, and the shopping hours were limited to the most inconvenient times, and when there was nothing anymore to be sold. So, but all this we could cope with, because it was gradual, and it was just sort of bricks, which it was a bother, and you could cope with it, and you could adjust to it, and if it didn't become any worse, so it would have been bearable. And of course, school children stopped being accepted at schools, Jewish school children, and there was no education provided for them really, but this all really didn't concern me, because I didn't have any children then, and I got married only in 1940, when they were in Prague already over a year, the Germans, I mean. And my husband was an architect, and he was so busy with German clientele, really, who occupied Prague and who found his language and his looks. He looked like a German, he spoke like a German, and they liked what he did for them, and so it was all slightly unreal, because in private they were polite and pleasant, and I died under this when they came with those Hakenkreuz up there, and it was a funny sort of unreal situation.
But there were people who did resist.
Oh, well, that I can't judge, I don't know. And I don't know anybody who would have this sort of experience, that your husband would be working for them 24 hours a day or something, and they paid as well or better than anybody else, and they took him out with them sort of to nightclubs, because he built nightclubs for them, and coffee houses and things like that. So the situation was slightly unreal, I must say, and you can't definitely use it as a norm for the time when the Germans came to Prague.
Why do you think these were allowed to take place so easily? You seem to think that it was done very easily.
But this is all my idea, it's not confirmed by anybody. I think they really didn't know themselves what they were doing or how they want to do it. And I haven't got a clue how they did it in Germany itself. But it looked sort of, they tried this and they tried that, and it got worse and worse. But I don't think it was planned properly. it was trial and error, but I may be totally wrong, I don't know. But as it was so gradual, so you got used to one thing and then the next came and you got used to the next one, and it got worse and worse, but as it was so gradual, well, so you adjusted. We were still in our homes and we still got the rations. We had ration cards, so we weren't hungry. Perhaps we didn't get all what the normal inhabitants did, but one could cope with all that. That's what I'm trying to say. In October 41, the first transport left for Poland. We were told they go to Lodz, which is now in the Ukraine, I think. But at that time it was still part of Poland, which was occupied by the Germans. And nobody knew what to think about it, and nobody knew why were these 5,000 people. There were 5 transports, each of 1,000 people, and they were mostly academics and sort of the higher echelon of the Jewish community. Academics and very rich people who still were there, who didn't emigrate and all that. And then there was a pause, and then at the end of November 41, 2,000 or 1,500 young able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 35 were called up and left for Terezin, which is about 60 miles from Prague and which was a garrison town from the 18th century. And that was very suitable for the purposes they had in mind, because there were the barracks ready and there were no soldiers because there was no army or anything. And so these men were sent there to start preparing these various barracks for the invasion of the transports which were to come. But we didn't know all that. We just were told that the man went to Terezin, and we followed the women, I mean the wives, and followed in about a fortnight, and we were separated, sexes were separated in various barracks, and we weren't really allowed to walk out freely in the first few weeks or months. But as we were all young and capable and no children actually. So we took it in a sporting spirit, like a scouts outing or something like that. And we did only the things which they wanted us to do, which was all feasible, keep it clean and put up things, and the men put up the banks, 3-tier banks, and so on and so on. And that went on for about a month, and we saw our husbands sort of an hour in the evening or something after work. They were allowed to come and visit or something, but that I don't remember quite clearly anymore. But in January 42, suddenly the Germans thought we are having too nice a time and nothing was happening, and they started hanging. There were 2 hangings of young men of about 8 the first one and 8 the second time, for really nothing, that they tried to smuggle a letter to their parents or something like that. They didn't commit any crimes, they didn't do anything against the Germans. But this was, I suppose, nobody confirmed it, this is my idea, that the Germans wanted to give us a warning not to take anything for granted, and that it won't go on like that. They hanged those 25 or 26 people, or 20, I can't remember exactly, but about 20. for no reason at all, and it gave us all a jolt which they intended to happen. I suppose. This is all supposition, nobody confirmed it. And then we started to sort of, and by then, which was, as I said, was January 42, the first transports from Prague and Brno and from the Czech lands started to come in. Old people, young people, all mixed up with children and all that. And the first transport to the east started leaving Terezin, but we didn't know where they were going and what. Nobody knew any east, but we were all frightened of that east because we didn't know what to think about it and what was going to happen with them, and they just were sent off. And so everybody who could somehow dodge it was very difficult, but well, I mean, one tried to avoid those transports. But what I forgot to say before, when we were sent to Terezin in the first place, we were promised that we will stay there, that we won't be in any trance. We didn't know what they were talking about. And for 3 years, they kept their word, which is quite a long time, 3 years. So we personally didn't have this dreadful worry what will happen in the next transport. Will we be included or won't it be included? As I said, until May 44, they kept their word. But in the end, by the time they evacuated the civilian population of Terezin, which was pretty quickly within a few months, and then they put barbed wire around the inside where we were allowed to move, and the Germans who were outside the barbed wire could do whatever they wanted there. They could do it anywhere, but we were confined to this barbed wire circle. But then you could move within those limits. You could go for a walk if you wanted to. You were allowed to move within the limits of this barbed wire circle. And the food, of course, was totally insufficient, but again, it concerned more old people and children than us who were sort of pioneers or whatever, and who knew where to steal a potato or a carrot or something. I mean, one finds so many ways and means how to help oneself, and especially when the older people started coming in, and my family, my parents and my sisters and my nephew and my aunts, and well, at one time I had about 15 people there whom I had to bring something to eat every day. So it was really, it sounds very petty or whatever, but it was my everyday worry what I will bring them to eat, because 15 people is an awful lot of people. Where do you steal it all? Well, and it didn't last very long, unfortunately, because quite a few of them were sent off, but as long as it wasn't my parents and my sisters were young, so they were occupied in various occupations, and one always finds some way, somewhere, bartering. One is very inventive if one has to be. And my parents and my sisters stayed in Terezin they came in 42 and stayed till 43, December 43, my parents were sent off, and by then we knew they were sent to Auschwitz, which meant nothing. I mean, it was a camp which was definitely much worse than Terezin, but that was that. I mean, no idea what. It's in Poland and it's dreadful, but that was that. This is all, I'm talking with hindsight, obviously, because at that time to be sent away was the biggest catastrophe which could happen, and you couldn't do anything about that, really. So my parents left, my sisters left in September 43, and my parents in December 43. But one got over it somehow. You didn't even let yourself think that you will never see them again. It just didn't arise, which is stupid, but that's how it was. And by then I was pregnant with my first child, and that's where the euthanasia comes in, because it was the biggest crime we could have committed, that I became, and the other women who were about five, we were about 5 couples who became pregnant in the camp. If you came pregnant from Prague or from wherever, so that was that. But how can you become pregnant if the sexes are segregated and all that? Impossible. Well, obviously it wasn't impossible, and we had to sign a paper, which we did, that the children will be taken away, and the word euthanasia had been used. We didn't have a clue what it meant, but one soon found out. But we signed this paper, and in the end, nothing happened. I don't know why. Nobody ever explained anything. So I don't know, the children were allowed to be born, and they were allowed to be sort of kept for as long as it worked. But my little boy died of pneumonia when he was about two months old, which actually saved my life and the life of my daughter. But this is again hindsight, because I became pregnant immediately again, because we calculated that now we have been there for 3 years, and the news from the war news started to be much more pleasant. And in June 44, the landing in Normandy and all that, so we thought the war will be over in a fortnight. I mean, the worst thing was still expecting us, but we didn't know that. So anyway, I became pregnant again, but it didn't, let's say in July 44, and by October 44, suddenly they started evacuating the whole ghetto, Terezin, and the promise that we won't be sent away was made void by them. I mean, not officially, they just started to take everybody. And it was again the same like from Prague. The men went, the able-bodied young men between 18 and 35, and my husband was among them. But we were told, I am sure on purpose, that we can go of our own free will to follow our husbands, and that it will be something very similar to Terezin, somewhere in Germany. And that was that. And I was one of the first one to go of my own, I mean to go and tell them I want to go. But I never saw my husband again after he had left Terezin, and we went sort of the direction Dresden, which was northwest from Terezin, but there the train changed direction and went east. Because we knew that it was going east through the first stop was Bautzen, which we knew was to the east of, I mean, nearing the Polish border, let's say. So we knew we were going east, and we assumed it would be Auschwitz, which still didn't mean anything. And I can't remember how long it took, a day or 2 days, let's say. But that was bearable, and we arrived on the famous ramp in Auschwitz, which we didn't know it was famous, and we wouldn't have known why it was famous. And there were these chimneys spouting flames and smoke, and the smell was undescribable, which nobody ever, you can't compare it to anything which you ever smelled in your life. And it was quite eerie, without knowing why. I mean, and the shouting and screaming by the Germans and the people, the prisoners who were in those pajamas, you know, the stripy things which we had never seen before, and they screamed as much as the Germans, and they were told to leave all our luggage on the train and get out and form fives and proceed towards the German SS, and which we found out afterwards. Dr. Mengele happened to be there when we arrived, and he had these enormous gloves or gauntlets, or whatever, gauntlets, which he held in his hands and showed this and that and this and that, totally meaningless to us. So some people went this way and some people went that way, and you just didn't analyze who went where. But the able-bodied ones somehow went to the right or left, and the old ones, which means from 40 years onwards, and the young ones, which means up to 15, went the other way. But we thought, well, we will be separated. They will be in those barracks, they will be in those. No, it didn't give you, well, one didn't know what, and you really didn't give it a thought. And so I can only describe what happened to me. We were sent to some place where we had to leave all our clothes, and they sent us through shower rooms, which we didn't know that there were two kinds of showers. This place where I went to was a real shower, and they shaved our heads, which was one of the worst possible thing they could have done. Not that it hurt, but that took away your personality somehow. We were naked, and now they took away the hair, and we were totally unrecognizable. And the girl standing next to me screamed, "Where are you? Where are you, Anka?" I said, "Well, if you are Mitska, I'm standing next to you." But it was that marked that you just didn't know what to think. But there were proper showers, and it was the first 3rd of October in Poland, and it probably was pretty cold, and we were naked and without shoes and without anything. And from those showers we went to some other room where they gave us some horrible rags, no underwear, and clogs. And we were totally disorientated because we didn't know really what was happening. Nothing happened yet to us, but it was eerie, I would say. And then we were sent to some barracks where there were already people in it, and a friend of mine said, because her parents came on the same transport as we did, and she asked them, "Where are my parents?" or "When will I see my parents?" And they started screaming and laughing, "Oh, you stupid somebody. They are already in the chimney." And we thought that they got mad, but they thought that we were mad. But within the next quarter of an hour, we not only figured out what was happening, but we were told what was, and not very nicely. I mean, they hooted and they laughed and they made fun of us. "Oh, you stupid so-and-so, you don't know what's happening there. Go up in the chimney," and no, it was apocalyptic, I would call it, because first of all, you couldn't grasp it because nobody ever heard anything like that before. Then, but you believed them pretty quickly because they were quite sure what they were saying. And then there were 3-tier bunks which were made, let's say, for 6 people each. But we were there 12, put 12 there, and we had to lie down if we wanted to sleep like sardines, sort of head and feet and so on and so on. But we were also frightened and so disorientated and so just like zombies. Before you grasped really that this is our future and God knows how long, and then next day was started with the roll call. About 4 o'clock in the morning, we all had to troop out and stand in the rain and wind and what have you, and we were being counted for about 3 hours. And you didn't, I mean, I was pregnant, but nobody noticed it, that I was pregnant, which was my luck, that otherwise there was only one way to go. But I fainted during that roll call, which was the most awful thing to happen to you, because somebody on the ground, so off to the gas. But I had some very good friends standing around me who propped me up, and, well, I woke up pretty soon. It wasn't fainting for an hour, but I couldn't hold myself standing up. And so we got through that, and then they gave us some coffee, which they called coffee, some brown thing to drink. But we got one vessel for 5 people, and no spoons in it. Well, do whatever you want, but that was that. And the midday meal was something similar, soup, which was totally thin, and there were potatoes or something at the bottom. But then it depended on the girl who distributed it, if she had friends there or didn't have friends there. Well, that's understandable as well. But as we came from Terezin, where relatively we managed somehow, and we still looked sort of well-fed, or we were young, and I don't know. And we weren't yet hungry, because we were so shocked by the circumstances. And those roll calls in the morning and in the evening, every day, 3 hours in that rain and wind and cold and shouting and screaming. All these gas chambers which you were watching all the time and thinking, is it my turn, isn't it my turn? And we ran around naked practically all the time, because there were constant selections, which meant that Dr. Mengele or somebody else kept on choosing people for work in Germany, which is hindsight again, or going to the gas chambers. And every time you got through that, I can judge only by what I thought, but I think everybody thought the same. If you got through it alive, you were glad. And you said, oh, it's marvelous, it's not me, it's my friend. But I mean, your life was nearer to you than somebody else's. And I spent 10 days in Auschwitz. And the last time we went through this sort of a selection again, and they sent us to some barrack, which I had never seen before, and I thought, this is it. But it wasn't it, because we were given some other clothes which were not any better than the ones which we possessed, but they were perhaps cleaner, and given some food, bread and something, a piece of march, and we were sent to the station and sent away from Auschwitz, which was like going to heaven. We didn't know where we were going, but it couldn't have been worse. And these were good strains, but with roofs on it, and there was no water, and we were traveling to Germany. We didn't know, but it was to the west, and we arrived in about 2 days in Freiburg, which was very near Dresden, and there we disembarked, and they marched us up to a huge factory where we sort of got in, and it was warm, and we thought, oh, it's warm, marvelous, how lovely. And there were bed bugs all over the place in the place where the banks were for us to sleep, which are most horrible sort of vermin, but that means that it's warm and there is some sort of food available there. So we invited those bedbugs with open arms. There were so many of them. We were given each one a little metal container, and during the night they kept on falling in it, you know. It was dreadful, but there we are. And then we started working on what looked like a tail piece of an aeroplane, tail fin. But it was too small, but all right, it was too small, it doesn't matter. But we were riveting the various pieces together, and I have never seen a riveting iron or whatever, and my friend who was doing the opposite to me neither. And so the workmanship was as bad as could be, but we couldn't understand that they let us work like that and sent that aeroplane in the air, but we didn't know that it was only for one trip and without a pilot. This is again hindsight, which we found out after the war, because they were the flying bombs, which were called here doodlebugs, and were meant for one trip only. But we found all that out only after the war when we came back home. And we worked 14-hour shifts, and by January 45 my pregnancy showed, but they couldn't send me back to Auschwitz anymore because Auschwitz didn't exist. It was liberated by the Russians on 27th of January. And so in that respect I was safe, and I got a sort of so-called lighter job to sweep the factory from morning, 14 hours a day. And when I finished, I started again. No, I swept and swept and swept for 14 hours a day, and it was a marvelous exercise for my pregnancy. It couldn't have been better, but I didn't know that either. And the food was non-existent. I looked like a pregnant skeleton, and no hair, and no, it must have been quite something. And we worked there till about the beginning of April 1945. Then they had to evacuate the factory because the Americans were already too near. And we were put into coal wagons without roof and full of soot. And we sort of were squeezed in like sardines. No, it must have looked just ghastly for the onlooker because the soot stuck to everything and you had no way to get rid of it. And we crossed the Czech frontier. Oh, I forgot to speak about the raid on Dresden, which we watched from that factory where they locked us up, and went to the shelter, and we were sitting there and hoping for a bomb or two to fall on us. We wouldn't have minded at all, but they didn't. And we watched the raids on Dresden, and it was one of the most marvelous theaters I had ever seen in my life. And the morale, what it did for our morale was undescribable. But anyway, that's nothing really happened to us. And then we went in those coal wagons across the Czech frontier and hoped that they would transport us back to Terezin, which was very near from there. But they didn't, and we turned south and were sort of moving towards the Austrian frontier. And we knew there is only one concentration camp there, which was Mauthausen, which had the same reputation as Auschwitz. But again, as we never experienced it, so we didn't know what sort of reputation. And we arrived in Mauthausen, and I started to have birth pangs, and people who couldn't walk, which I obviously couldn't, were transported in some carts because the camp proper was on top of the hill. So I was on this one cart and I was having the baby somehow or other, but not quite at the end. And I had, when we arrived at the hill, I had to get out of this one cart and go on another one, which took us down again to the so-called hospital belonging to the camp. And the baby was born midway down the hill and didn't move and didn't cry. And well, it was quite eerie because I was sitting up there and there were about 30 other women on that cart, and lice were crawling around in millions, and these women were all about to die of typhoid or typhoid fever, I don't know what. And we arrived in that hospital and they called a doctor and he cut the baby off and said, "You have got a little boy." I said, "Fine." And the little boy was wrapped in paper because there was nothing else. And within about 3 days, the Americans came and liberated us, which was fantastic. But what I forgot to say, the day before we arrived there, the Germans blew up their gas chambers to not to leave any traces of what they had been doing. And they became that small, and they could have killed me with their generosity. They brought me food, macaroni swimming in March, which could have killed me because we really had hardly any food on our stoves. And I hadn't washed for about 3 weeks. But I had enough milk to feed 5 children if it needed, if the need had arisen. And then when we were already free under the Americans, I said to a little nurse who was running around, "Why don't you give my little boy a bath?" Nobody looked at him for I don't know how long. She said, "What are you talking about? It's a little girl." And I started to have hysterics because I never unwrapped those papers or whatever. And there were quite a few doctors in the camp, and they all came to have a look at this miracle that the baby was alive, that I was alive, and instead of a boy, that it was a girl. And I was told that it can happen because if the sexual organs either can be too small or too big for one or the other. Well, I didn't go into any details, so I was delighted to have a little girl. Well, and in about a fortnight, they sent us home to Prague. And that was the worst moment of the whole experience, because we arrived in Prague where the revolution ended the day before. And there was no electricity and nobody expecting us and no sort of nothing. We all, what kept us alive was going home. And suddenly we realized there is no home. Everybody knew that our parents and our relations, if they weren't there already, so they wouldn't come, which was quite obvious. And where shall we go for the night, or what will happen? Well, then in the end the Red Cross appeared very late and accommodated us in a hotel, and the next morning I begged for the fare for the tram, because I had a cousin living in Prague who was married to a non-Jew, and I had hoped that they might be there. And I got there, and through some grapevine already they knew I was coming. I don't know how, and the story is unimportant, but they knew I was coming, and they opened the door and gave us a welcome like to a queen, and I stayed with them for the next 3.5 years.
Did you ever think, well, why is this happening? You know, what were your feelings about why this was happening?
No, you didn't have time to see logically. You just tried to avoid it instinctively and to disappear in the crowd as much as you could. You never questioned anything until long after the war, and then you started wondering how it was possible, but not then. I mean, this is what was happening. The Germans could do whatever they fancied. Nobody could do anything about it. You had to take it, and that was that. You know, I had quite a few criticisms. Why didn't you rebel? Or why didn't you do something? We were naked, hungry, and no weapons. And the Germans were fully armed and could treat us as they wanted. So this argument was brought about by Jewish people who couldn't understand that we didn't actively rebel. I can't describe it, that it was totally out of the question, because you would have asked for to be shot immediately, so what good would that have done? Even as low as we were, you still thought, I thought, I'll get out of that. But I mean, it was as irrational as everything else. I happened to get out of that.
And do you think that there were other people who could have done something about it?
No, because at least I don't know any. Because without a weapon, what weapon? The Germans were fully armed with revolvers or whatever, things you carry, bayonets and all that. And they were well fed and dressed, and we were naked with nothing. They didn't take only our clothes and our everything, but they took our personality away. You were just nothing. So to have revolt, at least I'm talking about my experience, that sounds totally irrational, because then you would have asked to be shot immediately. Like that, you may have escaped, as I can prove being sitting here and telling you the story. And you definitely never thought of it, how come that it's possible like that. Then, only when you overcame whatever you had to overcome and could sit down and think, how on earth did I get through with it, with my skin in one piece and with my child normal.
So let's talk about your feelings now. I mean, what are your feelings towards those who did this to you and your family?
Well, I will hate them to my last breath, the Germans in general. The young ones can't help it, and the three generations really, but my generation of Germans really, rightly or wrongly, no. But I mean, this is quite personal, and I had the worst possible experience. My parents, my sisters, my nephew, my aunts and uncles and their children, there were at least 35 people with whom you would call your near relations. But I'm talking now really about my father and mother and my sisters, which were the nearest. My first husband, my daughter's father. Why? Nobody can answer that. But all this came only when we were actually in a normal household, normally dressed, normally fed. When you started feeling that you are back among the human race, apart from the Germans. And it stayed with me until today. And
what about those people who try to make sense of all that happened and their belief in God? I mean, there are Jewish people who are practicing Jews who believe very much in God, and they ask questions. Well, where was God at this time?
No, they don't ask, but I ask that as a Jewish person not practicing. Well, where was he? But I don't want to offend anybody. I mean, this is my personal experience, and if he exists, which I don't believe in, so where was he? But please don't take it personally. I really don't want. Everybody can think what they want. So I think that, and nobody. I mean, it's now nearly 61 years since the end of the war, and nobody has persuaded me so far that he does exist. So I don't think it will happen. But one never knows.
You know, the theme of the Holocaust Memorial Day this year is one person can make a difference.
Yes.
How do you think that people can make a difference now? What would you want people to do?
I haven't got an opinion of that because I really didn't give it a thought. When I first heard this slogan, well, you can look at it if this friend of mine who was standing next to me and didn't let me lie down but propped me up and helped me. Well, this made the difference between life and death. This is personally what happened to me. And cases like that must have been in thousands or hundreds of thousands, or perhaps in millions, I don't know. But that doesn't really answer this question, does it? But I found that people who really risked, non-Jewish people now, and there were so many who did, like Schindler or people like that, this I find absolutely admirable, that knowing what they were doing and they did it, that I'm talking now about non-Jewish people who risked everything, and that's phenomenal, I think. Because they knew the risks. They knew that the Germans didn't mind two hoots if they shot the whole family or not. So that I find admirable, more than admirable.